Today at the National Press Club, award-winning journalist Peter Greste. Peter was sentenced to 7 years in an Egyptian prison in 2013. His case sparked international condemnation, and after serving 400 days behind bars, he was finally freed. Peter Greste with the National Press Club address from Canberra.
Welcome to the National Press Club and today's National Australia Bank address. It is a particular honour to be on stage to introduce our speaker today, someone we are all so relieved to see back home. Peter Greste is an esteemed journalist. He has worked around the world for CNN, BBC and Al Jazeera. It was during his fairly brief posting to Cairo, it was meant to be a brief posting, that he was detained simply for doing his job. He then spent the next 400 days behind bars. Now, Peter says he just sat in a box while others fought for his release. But, of course, he's being far too modest when he suggests that. There are many, many people who fought so hard. But, of course, it was Peter Greste, through his evidence in court and through the very powerful letters that he wrote from behind bars, that championed the cause of free press, not just in Egypt, but around the world. Few people, of course, can bring together the political community, both sides of politics, but also the often fractious journalistic community in Australia in a way that Peter Greste has really done. I think this is a genuine Team Australia moment. Few did more, of course, than his family, and we're very pleased to have them all here today. His mum and dad, Lois and Eurus, his brothers and their wives. Thank you for being here. Thank you also to the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, who did so much as well, not just in keeping the pressure on the Egyptians, but in making sure the consular support was there for Peter Greste as well. Thank you all. I should mention before we introduce the man of the moment, you can follow along on Twitter here in the room, or if you're watching at home, the hashtag NPC @PressClubAust. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Greste.
Thank you very much. This is incredible. Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you there were an awful lot of things going through my mind when I woke up in prison about 7 weeks ago, but I can honestly tell you that standing here in front of you was certainly not one of the places where I'd imagined I'd ever be. It really is extraordinary to see how life can spin on a coin. On December 28th in 2013, I was still just a relatively unknown Common or Garden correspondent trying to make sense of Africa. And now, there's a knock on the door, the Egyptian police barge in, and well, through a truly bizarre set of circumstances, I'm here. It just goes to show you that you really can't take anything for granted. Now, as is traditional at these kinds of speeches, I've got to start with a round of thank yous. And if I went through a roll call of everyone who deserved a special mention, we'd be here until Christmas. And inevitably, I'd be upsetting someone who I'd inadvertently be left out. So I want to say at the outset that I'm not even going to try. Instead, I'm going to walk you through a few key individuals and groups to give you a flavour of what went on during the campaign to get me and my colleagues out of prison. First, of course, of all, I'd like to thank the National Press Club for this platform. It goes without saying that every journalist wants one. We wouldn't be in this business if we didn't, and I feel incredibly honoured to be here before an audience of my peers and, in fact, the entire nation. And all because, well, whatever anyone says, I really didn't do much more than sit in a box for 400 days and write a few notes. Secondly, and I know this is going to sound a little bit weird coming from a journalist, but I really do need to thank Australia's politicians. I do know that they are generally considered to be a pretty thankless lot, but in this occasion, my family and I really do have an awful lot to be grateful for. And in the current political climate, it is rare for a genuinely bipartisan issue to emerge. But on this occasion, both sides of the House grabbed our cause with both hands. Delighted, I suspect, to have a genuinely uncontroversial cause to hold on to. Now, I know, for example, about a couple of hearings at the Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee that got rather raucous. Now, I clearly can't go into some of the details, In fact, there's a lot that I won't be able to talk about this evening, particularly because our case is ongoing, and I will speak about that later. But I do know that one of the hearings was described as a genuinely Australian moment, in which the politicians of all stripes fiercely defended what we like to think of as the very Australian ideals of justice and a fair go for all. This was important not least because it made clear to Egypt and to the world that no one here seriously believed the allegations against us. Now, that sense of injustice seemed to drive a lot of political figures who either volunteered to make representations on the family's behalf, or who spoke in Parliament, or contacted us, or simply to offer their support. And even in the case of Nick Xenophon, offered to go to Egypt as an envoy, although I suspect there are more than a few coalition politicians who might have been thinking more along the lines of a prisoner exchange. Now, at this point, I really must make a special mention of Foreign Minister Julie Bishop and her Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Minister, please, I'd like to acknowledge you. If you wouldn't mind standing up again. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I know there has been some criticism of the effort that the ministry made, but one of the keys to successful diplomacy is getting the balance of the public and private pressure right. I've heard from more than a few independent diplomats who've remarked on how astutely that you and DFAT handled our case, and in particular, how well you used your secret weapon, and one that I think has gotten you into a bit of trouble even over the last few days, and that's those rather laser-like eyes of yours, the infamous ones. One person, again, I can't say who, commented on your uncanny ability to smile very warmly, particularly at a diplomat, and at the same time burn holes through the back of their skulls, giving them the distinct impression that they'd just been hugged by the Terminator. Now, at a more personal level, while I was in prison, I remember hearing a news conference that you gave on the steps of Parliament House. Again, I can't tell you how I heard this, but I did hear it. And I remember being actually quite shocked, quite surprised by how emotional you seemed. And also upset and angry, genuinely angry, in a way that you don't often hear from a politician. And it took me a moment for the penny to drop that actually you were talking about me. This was on the day after our conviction. And that was a very emotional moment. One thing that you need to understand is that your personal involvement and the involvement of a lot of Australia's politicians really made a difference to all of us in prison, because it meant that our cause wasn't personal. It wasn't just about us against the Egyptian government. We had the backing of the entire Australian government and indeed the Australian people, and that meant more than you can possibly imagine. More broadly, DFAT itself was remarkable for the support that they gave my family and I. Now, I know they deal with hundreds and possibly thousands of consular cases every year, and of course, under these circumstances, you'd need to approach each one with a degree of professional detachment. To begin with, that was the case with the Australian Embassy staff in Cairo, and I remember meeting the Consul Erica Tolano at the prosecutor's office at the rather intimidating National Security Building where I was first interrogated. She had a certain icy look about her that said, "Oh God, what's another obnoxious Australian gotten themselves into?" But it didn't take long for her to get involved, and with a level of personal commitment that went way beyond anything expected of a civil servant. Now I ask you, how many consular officers do you guys know that would actually raid their daughter's stash of Freddo frogs to deliver one to a convicted terrorist in prison? Minister, I take it that's not in the ministerial guidelines. Ambassador Ralph King in Cairo, who led the team, was also an extraordinary asset, bringing all the wisdom and experience of an old Arabist, which I should say an experienced Arabist. I don't think you'd like me using that word old, really, no. And certainly a certain haughty superiority that really had the capacity to intimidate even some of the most seasoned and hardened of Egyptian prison officers. I remember one remarkable day when Ralph came to visit me in prison with his full diplomatic retinue, full of flags and the diplomatic cars and his minders and so on, to the point where, and it threw all of the prison officers into this terrible flap to the point where they were even offering me coffee and biscuits. Now, at this point, I really do need to bring in the Latvian government because they also joined the fight with extraordinary energy. In fact, I only discovered while I was in prison that the Latvians had granted me dual nationality. That story is another one that's a little bit too long to tell here. You'll all have to read the book. But I mention it because on the same day that Ralph came to visit, his Latvian counterpart, Ambassador Iveta Sulka, also arrived. And I also later discovered that this was all part of a very carefully coordinated diplomatic dance in which she came not only with her vehicles and a diplomatic staff and flag and so on, but also her biometric machines to issue me with a Latvian passport. And for once, that passport photo really was a mugshot in prison. Now, if politicians are amongst the least loved of Australia's creatures, they compete for the title with the nation's lawyers. But I must also make a special mention of my barrister, Dr. Chris Ward, and solicitor Chris Flynn from Gilbert and Tobin, who both worked pro bono and came up with an extraordinarily creative solution to the rather awkward diplomatic and legal problem of moving me out of Egypt. And then there's my family. Oh God, my family. You know, there was always a danger in coming here this evening with my parents, my brothers, my sisters-in-law, because as any one of you would know who's seen the news conferences and the speeches and the interviews that they gave, that there was always a real danger that I'd get upstaged by all of them. They were performers par excellence. And, you know, although we're never going to fully be able to draw the line or draw a direct line between any particular action and this outcome, the situation is far too complex for that and the issues too involved. But there is one thing I can say with absolute certainty here this afternoon, and that is that I would not be standing here before you if it weren't for my absolutely extraordinary family. Now, as anyone would know, my dad is probably one of the most recognisable figures in his own right in this country at the moment. That's in no small measure to his sartorial style. After his press conference to announce my release, he wore that famous red shirt, red fedora, and his now famous checkered happy pants. And anyone who saw that couldn't possibly forget. The photos were extraordinary. They went everywhere. And I think Dad is now one person who is really genuinely given a new meaning to the term trending. Almost continuously from the moment my trial started, we had someone from my family in Cairo. My brothers burned through their holidays, their sick leave, their long service leave, and the patience of their long-suffering wives and kids to tag team it in Cairo. Andrew was the first to visit me in prison at the maximum security Mulhaq prison within the Torah complex. And in fact, when he first navigated his way through the gates, I reckon that he was probably a good deal more shocked about the environment than I was. Social media was also at the heart of our campaign, and if you want to rev up your Twitter feed, if you want to add almost 30,000 followers to your feed, then I've got some advice. Get yourself locked up in Egypt and get a brother called Mike to manage your account. As so often happens in these things, Team Greste got organised. My sister-in-law Kylie handled the correspondence to me, filtering literally thousands of letters from friends, from colleagues, from complete strangers, from students, children, housewives, retirees, from letters from people in remote communities who understood a thing or two about isolation. And he told me about the routine lives, bringing a vision of normality to what really was for me an utterly abnormal situation. Those letters turned out to be a source of enormous strength, helping to give meaning to me in what often seemed like a quite helpless situation. Now, I'd also like to take the chance to plug that book that we've just heard about, a book of notes, of letters that were compiled into a book called Prison Post, published by Aditya, with proceeds going to the Foreign Prisoner Support Service and Martin Hodgson, who deserves a special thanks for the help that they gave my family and our campaign from the outset. My other sister-in-law, Nikki, handled Facebook, one of the key interfaces between the campaign and the public. We got 21,000 supporters who then got involved and spread the story even more widely. Now, Nick and Kylie both devoted countless hours to the computer, handling a huge public relations machine. And here I need to make special apology to my nieces who endured the absence of their parents. And I know that when my 7-year-old niece, Sophie, finally heard that I'd been released, the first thing she said was to her mum, "Mum, does this mean you're not going to be spending so much time in front of the computer?" And finally, although they're not technically my family, there is someone else I really do need to mention because they really do feel like family, and that's Heidi and Steve Ross. One of the things that emerged in this campaign was the extraordinary way in which people with absolutely the right skills emerged at precisely the right time to support us. And so it was with Heidi and Steve. Now, Heidi's an old friend of mine. She's a talented journalist, former journalist in her own right, who gave it up to run a luxury camp in the scenic rim up in southern Queensland. She also was a housemate of mine many years ago, and along with Steve, she was crucially a pair of seasoned campaigners who cut their teeth fighting off coal seam gas drilling in their region. Now, Heidi's experience on both sides of the microphones and her extraordinary loyalty as a friend meant that she took on what turned out to be a full-time job managing the media campaign and acting as an advisor and confidant to the family. She'd have her ear clamped to the phone on her shoulder while she was busy sewing tents for their luxury nightfall camp that they've been building over the past year, and it has just now opened. And that really is in spite of the extraordinary sacrifice that both she and Steve made. And so what's become evident to me since I got out was the extraordinary scale of this campaign. And this is the extent of support we got from politicians and diplomats, from human rights groups, and indeed from ordinary people around the world. Now, of course, in prison we had vague hints of this. There are occasions when snippets filtered through the very efficient and very effective prison grapevine. Kylie's selection of letters would come through, and I'd have some idea of how ordinary people would get involved. And we'd get the occasional newspaper article also smuggled into us. But I've got to tell you, nothing, but absolutely nothing, conveyed the genuine scale of this thing, the way that so many people got so emotionally and personally involved in this campaign. I'm still struggling to understand how this happened, but there is one more thank you that has to be made, and that is to us. And by that I don't mean we three, the Al Jazeera journalists in prison in Egypt. I mean the collective us. Because if there was one other truly remarkable thing that emerged out of this battle, it was the unprecedented sense of unity amongst the wider journalism community. Now, as everyone in this room well knows, and as we've just heard, we journalists are a cranky, cantankerous lot. We're almost impossible to organise, we are by nature argumentative, and we'd much rather compete than cooperate. And in fact, I dare say that the only time that any of us ever move in the same direction is when there is a bar in the room. Now, as everyone here well knows, through our detention, the media somehow abandoned the habits and the instincts of a lifetime to line up behind us in a truly extraordinary way. I'm not a student of media history, so I really can't say it with any certainty, but I'd be willing to bet that journalists have never united around a single common cause in the way that they did ours. And in fact, not only have journalists united, but politicians have united. And how many times can you honestly say that journalists and politicians have all been on the same side? There were the demonstrations. I know that the MEAA was at the forefront of some of those here. There were the Zipped Lips campaigns, the letters signed by our colleagues and rivals. We know that the subject was consistently coming up in news conferences and interviews. And surprisingly, some of our most vocal supporters were our direct competitors, like the CNN, like the BBC, who'd normally rather eat their own babies than acknowledge the opposition. At the personal level, it was hugely empowering. It helped put rods of steel into our spines, because we came to understand that this was about something far bigger than the three of us alone. This was about the universal principles of freedom of expression, of the public's right to know. And we knew that our colleagues were right there with us. Now, this matters not just because of the impact on us and our case. Right now, the very idea of a free press is under attack, from groups who take the heads off journalists to individuals who'd shoot up a magazine office in Paris or a free speech conference in Denmark, to governments trying to limit the scope of our work with draconian legislation. What you did was serve notice on anyone who'd attack those most fundamental principles that we are united. You made it clear that these are things we are prepared to fight for as one. And whatever happens from here, we must not lose that singular voice. Now, I mention this not just because I want to make you feel all warm and fuzzy. That'll be the red wine. But we need to understand that freedom of speech is being threatened in ways that we haven't seen for a generation. Rarely have so many of us been imprisoned, beaten up, intimidated or murdered in the course of our duties. According to a count by the Committee to Protect Journalists, last year 60 were killed on the job or because of their work. That number is slightly down from the 70 who were killed the year before, but in the past 3 years they have been the deadliest since the CPJ began compiling records in 1991. And here's a statistic that obviously interests me. At the end of last year, the number of journalists in prison for their work stood at 220, with China, Iran, Eritrea and Egypt all topping the list of the jailers. Another group, Freedom House, has produced a map of charts of press freedom across the globe. Purple marks the countries where the press is not free and that there is a vast stain that spreads across Asia, through the Middle East and down into northern and central Africa. The yellow patches that mark a partly free press spread across most of Latin America, West Africa, East Africa and a few corners of Southeast Asia. Depressingly, the Freedom House reckons that the green bits, the bits that cover Western Europe, North America and Australasia, cover only 14% of the world's population. 14% of the world's population who enjoy a truly free press. Now here's one more statistic that has me worried. Of those journalists put in prison, 2/3 of them are on there because of anti-state charges such as terrorism or subversion, just as the 3 of us were in Egypt. That fact is troubling because it seems to confirm what I've suspected for a while now, that the atrociously named war on terror is itself a part of the problem. Throughout most of the past 4 decades, wars have been dominated by struggles over tangible things like territory or resources or ethnicity. Even some of the conflicts over competing political ideologies, like Colombia's civil war between leftist rebels and a right-wing government, were in truth struggle for control of resources. Those of us who've covered messy conflicts like Colombia or other local wars like the battle for resources in eastern Congo or political and ethnic power in South Sudan will know that the biggest risk comes from random bits of flying metal or a drunk soldier at a checkpoint, rather than any attack aimed specifically at journalists. It's risky, of course, but the dangers are usually incidental. They come from working in an inherently violent environment rather than in any place particularly hostile to journalists. Of course, propaganda is as old as war itself, and warring factions have always sought to control the narrative. But in these wars over stuff, the target has generally been the message rather than the messenger. But this brings me back to the war on terror, a conflict that is, by its very nature, indefinable, with no clear physical or ideological boundaries, and with a title that, frankly, means everything and nothing. Or rather, it means what any of the groups involved really wanted to mean. And in this way that we haven't seen in a generation, this is a struggle over an ism. It's a battle between a competing worldviews much more than it is over a fight for land or resources. And in this struggle, the message is as much a weapon as any gun. Witness the way that Islamic State has used YouTube to recruit its supporters and terrify its opponents. Now, the trouble for us journalists is that in this conflict there is no neutral turf, no safe ground from which to report. As much as we abhor and condemn the executions of Islamic State of the American journalists Stephen Sotloff and James Foley, it was George W. Bush who set the ground rules in the wake of 9/11 when he declared that you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. That single statement made it impossible for reporters to hold to the principles of balance and fairness without being accused of acting as an agent for the enemy. Since the war on terror began, governments across the globe have used the T word as an excuse for all sorts of attacks on human rights and press freedoms. It almost feels like a kind of globalised McCarthyism, where simply invoking terrorism is enough in some cases to get away literally with murder. Now, I don't mean to minimise the risks of terrorism. I know that this is a very live issue here in Australia at the moment, and nor do I want to blame governments alone. The Islamic State's executions are simply the latest and most shocking examples of the problem on the other side of the ledger. But in this new world, to simply ask questions about the conflict or to seriously investigate either extremism or the government's handling of it is to make yourself a target. In the view of both sides, if you cross the lines in pursuit of our most fundamental principles of balance, of accuracy, of fairness, you effectively join the enemy. In effect, what it has done is to make the media the battleground. It's a chilling redefinition of Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "The media is the message." Now, for me, this is personal. As you know, I've just come out of 400 days in an Egyptian prison cell, something that often struck me as particularly tragic and ironic, given that I was accused of collaborating with Islamist extremists. Something most of you may not know is that I was in Somalia back in 2005 when my producer Kate Payton was gunned down. She was murdered by Islamist extremists. Now, in prison, I often thought about what we'd done to upset the government. And in a way, I might not have minded being in prison so much if we genuinely had pushed the boundaries. I've done that plenty of times in places where my own radar was much more finely tuned, where I was far more aware of the boundaries, of where those boundaries lay, of what might upset a government or a warlord, and of what their response might be, and of what I could legitimately get away with. But in Egypt, we were quite deliberately playing with a very straight bat indeed. I'd only been there 2 weeks before our arrest, so I really wasn't in any position to probe the edges. I was simply treading water. My work was, I'd have to admit, rather routine. It was certainly nothing special. But the trouble is that in Egypt, it's the most polarised society I've ever seen in a place that isn't in civil war. And remember, barely 6 months before our arrest, the Muslim Brotherhood had formed the first legitimately elected government in the nation's history. They remained the single largest and best organised political force. So in the pursuit of balance and fairness, it made sense to pick up the phone and to talk to them. But it seems that that act alone made us targets of the government. Now, I'm not denying for a moment that there are other more complex political forces at play. Plenty has been said about the messy relationship between Qatar and Egypt and Al Jazeera's role in it all. But whatever those forces were, we were charged with and imprisoned for simply crossing that very specific political boundary. At this point, I'd like to remind you that we, all three of us, me included, are still on trial, and my colleagues Mohammed Fahmy and Beher Mohammed were last night, or yesterday afternoon, in court before yet another hearing in our retrial. And I remained also, by the way, a named defendant in the case. So far, the case does seem to be moving in the right direction, but given our experience in the last time round, we are still deeply concerned about where all this might be heading. And again, because our trial is ongoing, I really can't comment any further, except to say that we must not let up this fight for justice until both of them and all of those who are convicted in absentia have been fully vindicated and are free of the charges. And in a case that's become emblematic of press freedom, anything less would be both not just a travesty, but it would set a terrible precedent for this kind of debate and for governments that are considering draconian legislation everywhere. Now, I'm not going to suggest here that Australia is anywhere near that situation. In fact, every time I come home, I'm always struck by how extraordinarily lucky we are on just about every level imaginable. But what concerns me is that we take great care to defend those things which have genuinely helped keep our society genuinely stable and truly free. There is, of course, a very vigorous debate about the metadata legislation, and I really don't want to get too involved in that here. But in the arguments about the detail, I think we risk losing track of some of the higher principles involved. Remember, the media is the fourth estate, the fourth pillar of a healthy functioning democracy alongside the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. The more you weaken any one of those, the more you destabilise the whole lot. My work in more authoritarian places, I've often noticed that the relationship between the government and in the media, there is a sliding scale that defines the way that power is distributed. If you take power away from one, then you give it by definition to the other. In the current environment, it is all too easy and too tempting for governments to use the war on terror as a convenient excuse for dragging that slider to the right, to claim more power in the interests of national security, trading off the media's oversight role in the process. Even if we wanted to live in a police state, history suggests that we can never really truly deal with terrorism, and that perversely, the best way to tackle extremism of any sort is to keep an open, accountable society with a free media able to do its job interrogating not just governments, but those whose opinions tend to drift off into the political extremes. Now, anybody who's heard me before will know that I'm fond of quoting Albert Camus, who rather famously said that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Ladies and gentlemen, while Australia and other governments have been locked in this debate, we've also been turning it over in our own minds, and in particular, Beha and I often discussed it in our cell, and Beha came up with an idea that we've begun to take very, very seriously indeed. What we wanted to do was to find a way to help protect journalists that might transcend state boundaries. And in the end, he suggested some kind of universal media freedom charter, the kind of document that has no weight in itself, carries no legal weight rather, but carries the kind of moral authority of the Human Rights Charter. It would set a gold standard defining the relationship between governments and the media. It would set out the responsibilities of each. It would set out the boundaries and the way that the relationship is supposed to work. It could be used as a kind of benchmark by which both of us could be measured. Crucially, it would stand independently of national jurisdictions, free of the partisan domestic politics that so often scuppers these kinds of initiatives. If we get enough media groups and governments to sign on to the set of principles, it would be a tool that could be used to guide policy and to hold others to account. I know that this idea is still very much in its infancy. We're still canvassing some support and ideas. We're looking for supporters amongst the media, amongst governments, amongst human rights groups. But I'd like to take this opportunity to invite the Australian media, everyone here, to join the conversation, to help us with ideas and contacts so that we can draft something that really has the capacity to work. I know that there is quite a deal of cynicism about this, and last night we had a rather vigorous discussion about whether this was the right approach or not. The debate is still open, but I think it's a debate that we need to have, and I think that it is an idea that really has the potential to have some influence. Because this is important. We expect it will be controversial, but it seems clear that something has to be done to tackle the assaults on media freedom in general and the hundreds of journalists being killed, imprisoned, tortured and intimidated all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for that address. It is now time for questions from the cranky, cantankerous, angry lot, as you call them, our journalistic members. And we're going to begin with Emma Alberici.
Thank you very much, Emma Alberici from Late Line at ABC TV. Lovely to see you here, Thanks, Peter. Congratulations on everything you've done in the cause for press freedom. And I pick up on what you said about the rods of steel that shot into your back every time you knew about the campaign that was going on back here. And I wonder whether in your conversations with your colleagues who are still in Cairo on bail, whether those rods of steel are still being felt by them and how confident they're feeling about the future?
Yeah, two big questions. Let me deal with the second first. We are still very concerned about the future. As I mentioned, the way that this trial seems to be going is encouraging. The court does seem to be taking the process with the degree of seriousness that the first trial didn't. But we've also learned to our cost to take nothing for granted. So we need to be very careful about it, making any assumptions about the judicial process. All I can say is that things are positive. We are hopeful. We know that we've done nothing wrong. We know that we have broken no law. And so on that basis, we'd like to think that, and we would hope that the court finds us all innocent. On the second question, they are feeling likewise encouraged, and I think they also recognise that they have got a tremendous amount of support. But I think, tragically, one of the things that I feel a little bit embarrassed about saying this, particularly in front of a national audience, but my nationality, my ethnicity played a huge role in the kind of profile that this case got, tragically and frankly unfairly. And this is just the way these things work. And they recognise that fundamentally as Egyptians and an Egyptian Canadian, they're not going to draw the same kind of international attention that my presence in the case did. And so I really want to underline here to everyone in this audience and to the nation more broadly and everyone around the world that this case is not over, that our trial is ongoing, that I still remain a named defendant, and so that in the strictest legal terms, not much has changed since February the 1st when I was released. So we need to be very mindful of that. We need to make sure that everyone is watching this process very, very closely indeed.
David Crowe.
Thanks, David. David Crowe from The Australian. Thanks for a really thought-provoking speech, Peter. It's great to see you here. I wanted to ask you about the media being the battleground, as you described it, because some of the things that you were saying reminded me of that story that emerged in January, where there were the emails between journalists within your own organisation coming to terms with what had happened in Paris with Charlie Hebdo. And I wondered about your thoughts, whether you even got to have a look at that issue, after you were released, and your thoughts on this issue of, as one of the journalists at the time said, questioning whether the attacks on Charlie Hebdo were really an attack on free speech. What are your thoughts on that? Does free speech include that right to antagonise and provoke?
Yeah, I think we need to be very grown up about this, and we had some of these discussions with a lot of my colleagues in prison, not just the journalist colleagues, but a number of other prisoners who were fiercely religious Muslims and who felt offended by it. And one of the things one of the points that I made then, I'd like to make now, is that I don't think we should infantilise anybody. I don't think we should feel that simply by making what may be seen as offensive remarks is sufficient to either limit comment on those issues, nor does it justify in any way the kind of reaction that we saw. This is not a playground. Just because someone says that your religion is a nasty religion doesn't mean that we should get so offended that we lash out violently. We've got to have these grown-up debates and discussions. And so, at a personal level, I think this was about freedom of speech. I think we have to be very mindful of how we conduct these debates in public, and whether or not Charlie Hebdo crossed that line, I think, is another separate debate. But the question really is whether we should be legislating to limit that. And I don't think we should. I think we need to be grown up enough, sufficiently grown up and mature enough to be able to have these kinds of arguments, to risk offending others without descending into the kind of violence that we saw. Does that answer? Yeah.
Our next question from Shalila Medora.
Peter, Shalila Medora from The Guardian. Thank you very much for your speech. In it, you mentioned a little bit about the delicate balancing act when it came to the diplomatic angle of your release. I don't know if you ever saw overnight, but the head of the Thai army and de facto Prime Minister said that he could just as well execute journalists who didn't tell the truth according to him, that is. I wanted to ask you, where is the line when it comes to Australian governments and Australian journalists getting involved in things like this, in freedom of the press issues, with people we consider allies or friends?
Well, this is a question that probably better left answered to someone like the Foreign Minister. Look, I'm standing here as a press freedom advocate, not as a representative of the Australian government. My interest is in press freedom, and so the answer I would give you is that allies or not, we shouldn't really be standing for this kind of thing. I don't know why we would want to be allies with or be willing to support a government that makes those kinds of propositions, particularly if we insist that issues of freedom and openness and accountability are the things that really matter to us as a society. Simply making those remarks, even if you never do anything to carry it through, is intimidation in its own right, and frankly intimidation that is going to affect anyone's broadcasting. Nobody who's heard that remark, even if the Thai government never acts on it, is going to be able to put pen to paper and completely confident in knowing that what they write is not going to be held against them. They won't be held up and be hauled before the courts. And as I said, I think, listen, as everyone here knows, we're not meant to be friends of the government, friends of politicians. We're meant to hold them to account. That's our job. It's why we exist. It's what the whole point of the fourth pillar of the Fourth Estate is supposed to do. And we shouldn't be apologetic about that. This idea, I think there was another remark that he made where he said that it was the media's the media had a responsibility to hold the nation together, to support national unity at a time of crisis. And again, I think this is an incredibly dangerous policy to make. because what it does is it effectively shuts down the kind of free and open debate that helps a society work these things out. It's like any family. We all have rows, we all have our arguments, but it's the process of having those arguments, which aren't always particularly edifying or dignified or even pleasant, but the process of having those discussions is the way that society figures this stuff out. And if you can't get cranky and awkward, and if you can't shout at each other, then this stuff gets buried, and ultimately it comes back to bite you. And I think it comes back to bite you in the form of terrorism, frankly. And so, in my view, closing those kinds of debates down actually exacerbates the problem. It doesn't make it go away.
Catherine McGrath.
Thanks, Peter. Catherine McGrath from SBS. Congratulations, and to your family as well. Incredible effort by them. I'm sure we'd all like to borrow them if we could at times. Peter, your imprisonment obviously was a result of the situation in Egypt. It's extremely complex because, as you said, the Muslim Brotherhood were an elected government. How much freedom of press is there, not only in Egypt, but in nearby countries, to really examine that incredibly complex issue that I think in Australia is not even really discussed in great depth?
Yeah, I'm going to have to refrain from speaking specifically about Egypt, again, particularly because our case is ongoing and we are in a very delicate legal situation. But I think more broadly the conversation about press freedom and the role of the press in this kind of environment is one that, I mean, it's obviously taking place right across the Middle East. We've seen the remarks from the Thai government. This is the way that a lot of governments seem to be drifting. But as I said in my remarks, I think this is a way that the war on terror is being used as an excuse to introduce these kinds of draconian legislations to try and close down the scope of the work of journalists. And ultimately, I think it's a damaging thing. I can't, as I say, I really don't want to get more involved in the specifics of Egypt, but it is an ongoing debate.
Can I just follow up? Because I think one thing could be in Australia, there's not a lot of discussion about this. And this is about press freedom as well. How do you, as an advocate, encourage Australian media, Australian journalists to really look at these issues?
I'm hoping that by being here before you is a good start for that conversation to happen. And, you know, I kind of invite commentators, and I'm hoping people will write letters to the editor. I hope we'll see a few op-eds come out of this. You know, stoking this debate is one that we have to have. Obviously, there has been a lot of discussion and debate around the metadata legislation. And I haven't been in the country long enough to really get involved at a personal level. I'd like to take a closer look and see what we can do with that. But I think that we need to, as I said, hold to those principles, and we need to have a bigger debate about what the relationship should be between the press and the government, and whether which direction it is that we're ultimately heading. Which way do we want to go with this? Do we want to head towards more authoritarianism, or do we want to head towards more openness and accountability? That's the way the slider works. It seems to me to be quite binary, and we need to be conscious of that dilemma. That's a discussion that the nation needs to have.
Paul Osborne.
Paul Osborne from Australian Associated Press. Thank you very much for your speech, and we're very grateful to have you here today. I have a moral dilemma and a question for you. On my desk in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, I've had a post-it note sticking at the top of my computer. It says Free Greste. It's been there for almost 400 days. Very prominent. I'm wondering whether I give it to you or whether I keep it on my desk as a reminder. But you may answer that, but I have a question for you. The press is under fire for being all about gossip and entertainment and so on. I'm just wondering what areas of public policy and international affairs do you think the media is ignoring at the moment? What are some of the big issues do you think that really we need to get our teeth into?
Oh, gosh. After spending 400 days in an Egyptian prison, only getting out about 7 weeks ago, and spending a good month of that abroad, I'm not quite sure I'm qualified to answer what should and shouldn't be in the Australian press, but I am going to make one broad generalisation which is probably going to make me quite unpopular amongst a lot of editors. But I'm quite, and I would say this, I don't feel quite so anxious about this, but I am quite disturbed by the lack of coverage of world affairs in the Australian press. I don't think we really pay sufficient attention to the rest of the planet and what's going on around us. I know that this is largely because editors and the pollsters, the marketing guys have said that the Australians aren't that interested in international news, that they're much more interested in what's taking place in their neighbourhood than they are what's going on overseas. But I think this is one of those moments where the media as a whole needs to take a principled position and say that as a nation we need to understand. If we don't drive this forward, if we don't push out those stories, if we don't make people aware of what's going on, then people aren't going to take an interest in it. And so I think we have a responsibility to place international news, to place foreign news higher up the agenda than we do. And I would hope that the Australian people would respond positively to that. Yes, we do tend to be quite a parochial nation. We do tend to not pay quite so much attention to what's going on beyond our shores. But I think that that's a problem, and I think Australia is far more the poorer because of it.
Our next question from Peter Harcher.
Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald. Peter, the commentary today about Australian journalists and journalists generally being a cantankerous, cranky, fractious lot is absolutely right. And can I, however, say that you've gone through what could be, for just about anybody, an embittering experience, and yet you've shown us today that you can retain scepticism and a feisty anti-authoritarian streak, and yet with good grace and fantastic good humour. It's a model for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My question is your proposed international principles for journalistic freedom. How would you deal with censorship of the internet? On the one hand, we have the case of China, which to us seems a clear-cut example of censorship that needs to be avoided and condemned. On the other, we see we are part of a US-led coalition that's now engaging in the active censorship of the internet to remove recruitment and other propaganda posted by ISIS. How would the principles draw the line there?
Okay, this is a really complex question, legal and political question. Part of it is, and one of the things I wanted to say from the outset is that this is still very much a work in progress, and I don't think we've been able to fully define some of those very complex issues that you're referring to. But let me deal with some of the broader principles that I think we need to bear in mind here. There is a very distinct line that we need to make, and again, the legislators and the lawyers are people that we need to get involved when it comes to understanding the difference between antagonising and incitement. It's one thing to upset someone, it's one thing to throw a few insults around, and I really do think we need to be very careful about legislating against that. But it's another thing to actually incite. Recruiting to violence is something that I think we need to figure out how to stop. I'm not going to stand up here today and say where I think those legal lines ought to be drawn, but I think that we do need to understand that there is a very clear difference between incitement and antagonism. I think that it is right that we do what we can, and we do need to bring in legislation to stop recruitment, to stop hate speech, to stop calls to violence. But that is a different thing to throwing insults around. On the question of censorship, of the kind of censorship that China is making, I think there really is no two ways about it. That isn't going to work if you want an open society. The Chinese don't seem to have made that choice. I don't think anyone's pretending that China is. The Chinese would probably not go so far as to say that theirs is a truly open society. But I don't think that kind of censorship can ever be justified.
Stephanie Boris.
Stephanie Boris from Macquarie Radio Network, 2GB. It's been a privilege to hear you speak and be able to sit in this room. Well done on coming home to you and obviously your family as well. Your family's extraordinary. You've focused a lot on thanking people today and also talking about freedom of the press, but I want to focus on you for a second personally and ask, how have you recovered after coming home? 400 days behind bars is a long time, and especially in Egypt. How have you managed to cope with getting back to normal life?
I'm not sure that I have coped, actually. I'm still quite bewildered by all of this. I feel a little bit like the rabbit in the headlights. Look, it's funny. I think a lot of people expect me to have come out of prison looking a little bit as though I've just walked out of Belsen, with bones everywhere and wild, starey eyes and that kind of thing. And because I seem quite normal, people seem quite surprised. However it's happened, this hasn't damaged me. I think, in fact, I'm going to stick my neck out here and have a guess that every one of you is either imagining or has imagined how you would cope if you're in my position, what it would be like for you in prison. And I'm here to tell you one thing, that all of us, and I mean every single one of us, I believe, is far stronger than we ever give ourselves credit for. I was lucky in a way because I was pushed. I had my limits tested, and I discovered, much to my surprise, that my limits are actually a whole lot further than I ever imagined them to be. That puts me in a very privileged position. I know now that I'm a lot stronger than I ever thought I was before I went into this situation. But what I'm saying to you is that every single person in this room, I'm sure, is a lot stronger than they imagine. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone is as strong as anyone else, but I wager that you would all cope with this far better than you think you do right now. I adopted a series of strategies while I was in prison. I realised that there were three things that we had to take care of. You had to be physically fit, you had to take care of your physical health, your mental health and your spiritual health. And so I got Ralph King, the ambassador, to bring in a program called 5BX, which is a program designed by the Canadian Air Force for its airmen during World War II to help them survive and stay fit during periods of incarceration if they were ever captured as POWs. And that allowed us to build a kind of an exercise regime every day. We also played a lot of mind games, mental games, while we didn't have the resources to stay mentally strong. And after I was convicted, the prison authorities agreed to let me start a master's degree in international relations. And I need to thank Griffith University for taking the trouble to do things the old-fashioned way and print out, literally, I'm not kidding, a box this big, around 13 kilograms of academic papers that they sent into the embassy, and the embassy delivered to me in prison. And so I was able to work on an international relations degree, master's degree, in a way that, in the old-fashioned way, with pencil and paper. And so that kept me mentally fit. And as I mentioned, I was able to also spend a bit of time meditating, just to try and keep my head in the kind of level space to kind of stabilise the ship and not let things get out of control. Because in prison, your mind is your greatest enemy. And so, after that, coming out, dealing with all of this, well, believe me, this is as scary as anything I went through in prison.
Our next question from Ursula Hager.
Ursula Hager from Network 10. Very nice to see you in person. My question, I know you said you didn't want to talk about the metadata laws, but given the ever-tightening of the anti-terrorism laws and the ever-shrinking budgets of the media organisations, do you think that press freedom, in some ways, we're fighting a losing battle, or are you hopeful?
No, I'm hopeful. Look, this is a debate, this is an ongoing debate, and these things ebb and flow, and even if we lose this round, I would hope that we don't give up that fight. Look, as I said to you earlier, we've got to look back at the things that really make Australia what Australia is. And I'd wager that that is on those fundamental principles of an open society, of accountability, of a fair go for all. And the only way we can do that is by having a press that has the space to ask the questions, to interrogate the government. And I think that, again, I really don't want to get into too many specifics, but I've spoken to a number of experts who seem pretty convinced that there are ways of managing both the security issues in a way that doesn't necessarily impinge on the journalist's capacity to investigate the government, to hold the government to account, and that certainly doesn't close down the space, that the very necessary space for people like whistleblowers to operate. If we do that, then I think we lose something fundamentally important to our society. And we need to bear that in mind. And this is something, as I said, that I believe has helped make Australia what it is today.
Our final question, Josh Dye.
Josh Dye from Sydney Morning Herald, Fairfax. Thanks, Peter. It's an honour to listen to your speech. I wanted to refer to your comments about how you felt your ethnicity played a part in your release. And I wonder if I could draw some parallels between your situation and the situation of asylum seekers in ongoing detention in Australia and offshore. Do you think the media as a whole has developed a blind spot to asylum seekers, and particularly relevant to press freedom? What do you think about the restricted access for journalists to these centres by their placement offshore or otherwise to freely report on the conditions to present a balanced picture to the Australian public?
Look, again, I'm going to go back to what I was saying earlier. I really don't feel in a position to draw any kind of broad conclusions about the performance of the press. And I'm not trying to avoid the question. I just haven't been around long enough and seen enough to be able to give you any kind of considered opinion. But, crikey, the question of asylum seekers, I'm also got to declare a certain self-interest in here. I'm the son of an asylum seeker, of a refugee. My father is Latvian. They were refugees that came to this country, and I know that, you know, I don't know quite what the statistics are, but a vast number of Australians, we all have asylum seekers in our blood. Only Aborigines are the ones who can claim to have any kind of, you know, genuinely Australian blood in them. And I think we need to bear that in mind, that this is what built this country. It was immigrants that built this country. I certainly do feel as though we've perhaps lost track of that debate. I am concerned about the lack of access. This comes back, as uncomfortable as it is, Minister. We need to have access. We need to see what's going on. And as difficult as it is for the government, if we close that down, if we make it hard for journalists to do their jobs, then we end up with dark spaces where things happen that really shouldn't be happening. The public has a right to know. It's as simple as that. This is our government. We hire the government. They work for us, not the other way around. And if we lose... If we lose sight of that, if we lose sight of the public's need to know and to make decisions and to make democracy work, then again, I think we run the risk of losing control.
Would you please thank Peter Greste?